Welcome to the Streets and People podcast, where we explore having more transport options that are less hassle to use. Hosted by Get Around Caboolture, we bring you 3 types of episodes. People and Projects share stories of change. Not Everyone Drives gives voice to non-drivers. Road Rules 360 unpacks road rules for people outside a car. Music by Grand Project, and let's make our Grand Project reimagining streets made for people. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes. I'm here with Matt Burke. Actually, I think I've known you pretty much since the beginning of Get Around Caboolture. I met you first at a conference. I'm here in Caboolture in Queensland on Gubbi Gubbi country. Matt, whereabouts are you? And tell me how you became interested in this whole area.
So I'm speaking to you 9 kilometres directly south of the Brisbane Central Business District in a suburb called Salisbury, right near the Griffith Uni Nathan campus, where I was full-time employed until late last year. I've spent the last 20 years of my life there. That's on the lands of the Turrbal and the Jagera Yagara people, who are the traditional owners of the Brisbane area. I became a transport planner because of a set of things that happened to me when I was 15. I found out that the park at the bottom of my street was actually a freeway reserve and about to be resumed for what became the Eastern Freeway in Melbourne. I went to a new school. It meant that I had to travel about 24 kilometres by different modes of transport, and they didn't connect, and it sucked. My stepsister died in a car accident that year. Just a whole heap of things happened that made me, as a very young, impressionable young man, think, what is wrong with transport systems in our society? How do we start to rethink this and just do this better? Why does this go wrong? How can we improve this? And how do we give Australians safe transport, good accessibility to the jobs, goods, education, services they need in daily life? How do we make people's lives better? It seemed to me, being stuck in the traffic jams, that being stuck in cars didn't make people happier. We lived in a place where basically to do almost anything, except for this very long 90-minute journey home to get from school, it was a landscape where you had to burn a litre of fuel to get a litre of milk. Almost everything required us to jump in my mum's car, and my mum was a single parent. It wasn't always easy. I had to just get around on foot or by bike in suburbs that weren't really built for public transport.
I did know the story about somebody who had a park that was being turned into a freeway at the end of the street, and I never knew that was you.
There's a few of us. I joined up the Coonamullen Forest Way Association, which was the anti-freeway campaigners in Melbourne. I met this guy, Graham Davison, who years later I realise is the great urban historian who wrote the book Car Wars.
I actually wanted to get Graham Davison on the show because I read the book. One of the people on my Facebook group who listens to this bought the book for me and asked me to get him on the show, but I haven't had any luck. So if you could put in a good word for me, I would very much appreciate that.
I'll put in a word for you. There's a few of us over the years who've thought, oh my goodness, really? Australian cities and where you live, Caboolture, the Moreton Bay area, and the new city that you're situated in is a product of what I would call the freeway city planning of that time. The post-war era, petrol rationing came down. Australia started building its own cars from 1954 onwards. Fuel was becoming cheap and plentiful, and we were building suburbia, including this suburb where I'm speaking was built in 1950s. People were encouraged to basically buy a house and land and car package for their life. And very quickly we started to sell 2 cars to the household. If it was a traditional nuclear family, mum and dad would both have a car. Now we're at a point where in the suburbs of the Moreton Bay region, and I just spent a week living in Griffin recently on the north side of the Pine River. And in that neighbourhood, it was quite clear there's basically a car for everybody between the age of 18 and 80. And there was no corner shop to walk to. There were some playgrounds and some local recreational reserves, but there was nothing else to walk to. Even to cycle, the shops were quite a distance away. There were great walking paths, fantastic street designs that made for relatively slow traffic, though it should be a 30k area. So the design was pretty good. This cyclone, there'll be no opportunity to walk to a corner shop to get something. And if public transport is cut, which is happening for the next 2 days, it's not going to be a very resilient community in that fashion. Our suburbs have problems. They have ills. We've started to improve some of the design and density. But then there are a whole heap of other things that we need to really start thinking about fixing.
Just for our listener, we are recording this on the day before the cyclone.
My neighbourhood is full of people tying down everything they own, boats, caravans. And this isn't a little category 1. I've been through 2 of those in my life. It's at least category 2, and there's some fears it might get up to a category 3 storm. The last cyclone to hit Brisbane was 50 years ago. We're not used to this.
What I thought this morning when I rode my bike up to the gym is how tidy the front yards look and how much they actually looked a bit more kempt, and that people have been in that space. I really miss that people are normally in their cars, they appear out of these 8-foot fences, and all you get to see maybe is a wave, but that's it. And then sometimes you can't even see the hand because now the windows are all dark, so you can't even have eye contact. The windows are fully sealed. It's very hermetically sealed, that space. So when you're on the outside, you actually can't see who's driving. I don't know that drivers necessarily are aware of how much they're not part of the street.
And the old eye contact that we used to use for navigating movements between pedestrians and cars is falling away. Thankfully, Australian windscreens have to be kept opaque, but the side windows and others are often well tinted. You're talking about how the garage has consumed the Australian house. And 1950s houses, when they were first built, 1950s houses were built without a garage or a carport. People had to add that later when they could afford it. This was part of cheap housing. These days, most households have a 1.5 car width garage or a 2-car garage. And I have to say, I've got a cousin in Melbourne who was planning on demolishing a 7-year-old garage in her very new house because her 2 giant obese cars didn't fit in her 2-car garage and the doors opening with stuff and everything. And they were going to demolish a very new garage simply to add that extra metre so they could all open their car doors. This kind of insanity is what we experience in Australia. And a lot of people, when they go and travel to Japan or to Europe or elsewhere, are suddenly like, why are all the cars so small? It's only the North Americans, Australia and New Zealand, who've really gone crazy for the US-style pickup trucks. Australian car fleets have been growing at about 1 centimetre a year. The tragic first consequence of that has just happened. So we are now redrawing the standard Australian drawing of a car park, which will mean engineers and land use planners, everyone designing car parks. We're going to redraw all those car parks in churches and shopping malls and everything else over time. And there'll be less of them because the length has changed. On-street parking is going to change as councils start to apply the standard drawing, and we'll have one less space here and one less space there. So there'll actually be less parking provision because of these obese vehicles. It's flying in the face of everything we've wanted about the Australian fleet. So we have not taken up electric vehicles in large numbers. We're not taking up smaller, safer vehicles in large numbers. We're adding these quite dangerous, large, high mass, poor sightline vehicles to our fleets that are a danger to pedestrians and cyclists.
Yeah, the other thing is that I feel that households have to carry the financial burden of that. So I saw some research which looked into how many ads people see about these big cars every day. And it was some astronomical amount, like 1,000 car ads per day. If you've searched for cars online, of course you'll see more advertising for cars. And the reason why car companies are so interested in selling these bigger SUVs and pickup trucks and everything is because they make a 30% margin on the sell price rather than 15% or 10%, which they do in those smaller little cars. Is that true?
So there's more than that. There's some policy settings that are actually encouraging Australia to have one of the most inefficient, fuel guzzling and polluting fleets in the entire universe. Only in the last 2 months, we have had fuel efficiency standards worth talking about in this country. So they only were enacted on the 1st of January and they only get enforced in July. The opposition party, they have promised to remove those fuel efficiency standards. Now, it's those standards that will start to drive a shift in the fleets that are imported into Australia. We basically don't build our own cars anymore. Motor vehicle exports are less than 140 million, I think. and imports are about 24 billion. We hardly do any manufacturing and export anymore. So companies are able to dump, or shall we just say, send to Australia, outdated, inefficient, and elsewhere in the world unsellable vehicles. So we're often getting the most polluting vehicles coming here. We have extremely low fuel taxes by OECD standards for wealthy countries. We have very low import duties on these vehicles. We do almost nothing to punish car drivers, and we do a whole heap of tax incentives that encourage people to purchase big polluting vehicles. That includes novated leases and these crazy tax write-offs for small business. The number one item that is purchased when that happens is usually a big ute, a utility vehicle of this type. The last time the federal government offered this, we added about 100,000, mostly diesel, big pickups and utility vehicles onto the Australian fleet, mostly used in urban settings, adding to pollution, adding to congestion, and adding to everything else. And then Australians are also some of the worst in the world in sharing their car trips. So we're down from 1.6 odd people per car trip in about the 1950s, 1960s. Earlier than that, it was even more, to 1.1 people per car trip. And that's despite having so many chauffeuring trips to drive children to school, where parents, guardians, grandparents, etc., are making often huge distances to get kids to school. And that's being exacerbated by private schooling. So many issues with our transport land use system, but those motor vehicle policy questions are really significant. And I cannot tell you how much, even amongst my bogan mates, people I met in football and other walks of life, they don't like driving around these huge pickups. They really hate them. I have so many women who talk to me and say, I hate driving around. I hate going to the car park near these cars. There's a loathing of these cars in the Australian community, a great distaste by anyone who is not in one, and looking down on everybody else. Despite that, there is no politics yet to deal with that problem. We feel like we have no agency. There is nothing we can do. Well, there are things we can do, and I'm not suggesting people go out and put chickpeas in the tyre of these cars to slowly deflate the things and stick stickers on the windscreen saying you're a moron for driving one of these things. That kind of vigilante stuff gets headlines and it makes YouTube videos and stuff. Not all that helpful. The real policy war is about what are we going to do here and how do we change our system.
I heard that our emission standards before this change in January we were on par with Russia. Russia and Australia are among the few developed economies without mandatory emissions and standards.
Even the policies we adopted were the US standards. We didn't go near the European standards, which are really driving change.
So what I want to know is, how much does a car actually cost? Have you ever looked into the cost of how much the full externalized cost of the car? So this is an economics question. One of the things I've been really curious about, because people go, wow, my car costs so much. And I'm going, well, apparently you're only paying for like 1/3 to the full cost of the car. So do you know, is there any basis to that?
There is. And so the big costs are in local roads, state-controlled roads, building out that road system, including all the bridges, the tunnels, the culverts, the wildlife protection, the signals, running those signals, keeping it maintained and expanding that system. You know, we're in a region where over 1,000 people a week are moving to this region, just to Greater Brisbane. For each 1,000 people arriving, there's about 600 plus cars arriving. We do not have enough road space for that, especially on those longer distance trips to get to key activity centres where the places of work are and where the key shopping opportunities and other things are. And I was amazed at the traffic congestion I encountered getting into North Lake Shopping Centre. I was just not expecting it to be that bad, but it was as bad as at any shopping centre in Australia, really. It took me probably 20 minutes extra on my travel time compared to a free conditions travelling at midnight trip would have taken. I was quite stunned by that. We have these issues. If you're adding up the purchase price of a car And let's take me as an example. I purchased an electric vehicle last year. I tried to go car free in the middle suburbs of Brisbane. I lasted about 18 months. My lovely fiance, we get married in 2 weeks. We paid about $33,000. It is a relatively fast car to buy because of all the other costs of buying a cheap car. I'm not paying for the extra hours to work to pay for the expensive car. So you think of these people who are buying these $90,000 vehicles, they have to work to own that money. I call those slow cars because if you add that as travel time, that is an awful lot of time worked. I am not paying fuel tax. It costs me about $10 a week to run this car for the amount of driving we do. We do less than 10,000 kilometers a year. We are spending almost nothing on recharging this, and I don't have solar. So we're charging in the middle of the day, just off the home batteries. Not once yet have I had to go somewhere that's required a plug-in charger. I've got the cord, I just haven't used it in 6 months. But the big costs, and this is the great subsidy to car drivers, my neighbour who's car free over the road here is paying for 90% of the roads I use, but not using them. He doesn't ride a bike and he doesn't drive a car. He sometimes uses them by getting on a bus. He pays local council rates, which is 90% of the road system of what people's travel is on. And he is cross-subsidising me. For the state-controlled network, stink car drivers are subsidising me because I've got an electric car and I'm a free rider. I'm not paying fuel tax. The Victorians tried to bring in a levy on electric vehicle drivers and it was found to be unconstitutional under the Australian Constitution. So no state or territory can bring one of those in. At the moment, if you want a cheap ride, buy an electric. But that said, Australia is banning the lightest and cheapest and somewhat safe vehicles that Europe and Japan has. Japan, the K-class vehicles, we're not allowing many of them into Australia because of side protection. That's an issue. But in Europe, they have a class called the quadricycle. So little vehicles like the Citroën Army, AMI, Friend. And we banned them in the 1970s in Australia because they were two-stroke engines. They were stinky, horrible, noisy, loud things. You couldn't speed limit them. Young people would get in them and fang around at huge speeds and crash. Now they're speed limited to 50 kilometers per hour. They are small, light. You can park two of them in the parking space of a standard car. They're safe enough that in France, they're letting 16-year-olds drive them. In Australia, we're banning them from our streets. And I look at Australia and I look at how much motoring is costing outer suburban people. ABS studies, large numbers of people are spending probably more than 20% of their wage on their motoring alone. And when you do that, you're adding significant transport stress. That's the academic term. And if you've also got housing costs, as most outer suburban Australians have, of more than 30% of your wage going directly on housing cost, the double combination of more than 50% on transport and housing cost is lethal. It is a major, major stressor and is a huge contributor to the current cost of living crisis in Australian cities. So here's me running an extremely cheap to run car. We do all these little zippy trips all the time and a few longer distance trips. And if I go to the Gold Coast and back, it costs nothing to like nothing. I do not miss the petrol station. And I have friends complaining about the price of petrol, complaining about their car loans, which are very high because they've chosen a very expensive vehicle, even with a novated lease. It's hard for me to have sympathy when they've bought a stink car.
A stink car is one that's run by diesel and petrol.
I ride a bike all the time. I have an e-bike, a fold e-bike, and a standard road bike. Most of my trips to work at Griffith were about a 3K ride through a nice safe route, through back streets and a forest reserve to get to the office. Every time I got stuck at the one big dirty set of traffic lights, I'd be next to stink cars and just consuming the fumes. The number of diesels that we still have on the roads in Australia is crazy. We fell for the lies of many manufacturers and they've been fined and found guilty, and perpetrators of those crimes have had to pay, but they lied and they put cheat devices into their emissions testing and claimed that they had invented clean diesel. and didn't invest in electric vehicles. And there's a whole suite of manufacturers that did that. And some of those car companies are now in great trouble. Places where the manufacturing of those vehicles is one factory town who may not have much of a future because they stuck to old technology. What comes out of the fuel pipe is stuff like benzene, really complex carbon molecules for which there's no safe dose. These pollutants are awful. Obviously, carbon monoxide, which is associated with all sorts of stuff, oxides of sulfur that cause sulfuric acid in your lungs and cause all sorts of problems, oxides of nitrogen that irritate, help cause asthma, the ultrafine particulate matter and the just fine particulate matter, which you can't see, for which, again, there's no safe dose. We make our pedestrians and our cyclists just consume this stuff. Australia is one of the worst in the world at shifting to electric buses, up there with our friends the USA again. We're really slow on this agenda of the EV uptake. I travel to China regularly. My partner's Chinese. They used to be the most polluted cities, horrendous. Now, many of the streets, you see clear skies, they still have an issue with coal burning. But the local pollutants from the fleet, which is more than 50% electric vehicles, and where bus fleets are 100% electric vehicles, you're just not consuming that direct, horrible emissions out of the tailpipes. And it's quieter. You sleep better at night because you're not getting the revving. They've never allowed Harley Davidsons, who have been breaking the law on our noise pollution codes forever. Let's not pretend. There's new technologies being used in other jurisdictions that can now identify the pinpoint source of noise and immediately fine the perpetrator, that we still do not use here. An easy way to control the bikie gangs.
So it's not only the collision rates, which are of course really high, and they're much higher when you've got an SUV, and even more so when you've got the bull bars. It doubles the figures of the fatality rates. There's some new research into tyre dust that it's even more toxic than tailpipe emissions, so that would be diesel and petrol. And there's other stuff that comes from brake fluid and brake pads and all that.
No, so we still have a big problem. So the electric vehicle is going to solve about 60% of the local pollutant issue. About 40% comes mainly from the plastic binder that is used in tyres and that is worn. And we have wondered for a long time, where is this missing particulate matter coming from in cities? We were capturing what was coming out of the coal emissions plants. We were capturing what was coming out of the factories and the bakeries and various other plants across the city. We worked out what was coming out of the fleet from its tailpipes. And we were like, where is all this missing pollutant from in this particulate matter, including these microplastics? It does now look like it is the plastics that are used to bind tyres, tyre wear. So every time I'm going out in my electric vehicle, which is a heavier vehicle because of the battery weight, I am churning up those tyres and contributing to that particulate matter. We've got other things we need to fix to make motoring better. The impacts of roads are pretty bad. The number one thing we can do is use cars less. Best thing for traffic congestion is to share our transport or use space-efficient modes of transport, which is walking, cycling, scootering, public transport, sharing our car trips.
The thing that I always think about is most journeys within the suburbs are within a couple of kilometres of home. It's the school run, it's nipping down to the shops, it's going to the medical centre, it's catching up with friends. That's kind of basically it. If we had good, safe infrastructure where you could easily get around in the suburbs, there are definitely things that local governments, state governments could do, like slow down the street speed, build infrastructure, those sorts of things, and then just make it nicer for people to do. Definitely, they can all be done with some other means than a car, for sure. And I'm actually wondering, is that something that somebody council, if they're sitting at the bottom of the pile going, I haven't got the power in this, I don't know what I can do, what's something they can do?
There are people like that in local governments all over Australia. Start small, think light, think cheap. It's always been the way. Maybe we can't convert the city of Moreton Bay, all its local streets, all those little tiny streets. And I'm not talking about the street that gets you out of your suburb, what we call a collector road, that takes you out of a suburb like Griffin and then gets you onto Henry Road and out. We're not talking those bigger roads. We're definitely not talking sub-arterials or arterial roads. They're for high speed and high volume traffic.
So here in Caboolture, just for our listener, I just want to give a heads up. A collector road would be Belmere Road. The state road would be the arterial road. That's Morayfield Road, King Street, Beerburrum Road.
But the streets we all mostly live on, those little streets, and those first journeys out of your suburb are on those little streets. If we were in most of Europe, those streets are 20 mile per hour or 30 kilometres per hour. So London now, most jurisdictions in London, it's now 20 miles per hour, 32 kilometres per hour. American cities have gone this way. All of Washington, D.C. is now 20 miles per hour. Huge areas of Denver and the city centre are now all 20 miles per hour. And we think we're giving children safety at 40. If a car hits a child at 40 kilometres per hour, significant chance, not just of death, but of those really serious long-term expensive injuries that can totally consume the tax base. We're talking $15 million of ongoing care. Look, I've lost a sister in a car crash. I'm one of those families that's experienced road trauma. It's never good. At 30k per hour, you almost never have the accident because the stopping times are so much better. And if you do, the force is so much less because people have had time to react. But at 30 kilometres per hour with cyclists, you get rid of the overtaking. Everyone starts just platooning at the same speed. So you don't have those unsafe behaviours. Having spent time in Canadian, European and Japanese cities where this is the norm, it's a polite way of driving. That road ragey stuff about being stuck behind a cyclist just doesn't happen as a driver in an environment where everybody's going 30k per hour. It just normalizes very quickly. The great thing about that as an intervention is how cheap it is. You can take an entire suburb and just say, we're not doing everyone, we're just going to do a trial, and particularly where there might be issues around a particular school, shopping centre or elsewhere. Only 6 months, we'll see how it goes. We're going to put up the 30k signs and we're going to make this at 30k. We will enforce it. You have to enforce it. So there was a project where they tried this in Portland, Oregon, and they didn't enforce it and it failed. You absolutely have to go in hard. Week 1, week 2, find people. We said we were going to do it. We did it. Everyone adjusts. And then people never want to get rid of it. It becomes so popular. So there's trials happening in the city of Yarra in Melbourne at the moment in a key area. We're all very interested in what happens with the behaviour. That's just going to spread. That kind of initiative is almost free. That's very little money to put up 30 kilometre per hour street speed signs. Those kind of initiatives can have a big impact. School travel programs. Brisbane's is one of the best in the world. We did evaluations of it a couple of times over the last 20 years, looking at the implementation and the effects of the active school travel program run by the wonderful Nina Wright and a group of people in the Brisbane City Council. They go into schools and they look and they listen and they say to the school, what are your problems? How can we work on those problems? Is it a little bit of safety at this crossing and a bit over here? And what could we do that could actually work? What corridor was coming into the school? If we were to build a culture where numerous kids will walk in cycling, would other parents be willing to let their kid just join the other kids? So we have less of this recreation of the D-Day landings happening as 1,000 SUVs descend on every school. Those programs have totally changed a number of our schools in Brisbane. And one not far from me, up on Ipswich Road, Junction Park State School, has had about 40% of all its traffic that was car-based coming into the school disappear. It's creating greater safety for every other child who's walking and cycling by getting rid of those cars. The children who walk, there's more and more studies showing that they arrive at school ready to learn. They've had exercise, they're awake, they're physiologically ready to learn. And they're getting their daily exercise. They're not video gamer kids just sitting down. There's also a lot of research about unaccompanied children and their travel in the built environment, starting to learn how to navigate low-level risks in the environment, how to physically navigate in an environment and understand the built environment, how you use it, how to engage with nature, and a whole heap of additional benefits that are not just the traditional benefits we would think of the physically active child who's out there and getting some sunshine. Everything we are looking at tends to say more and more and more, please do not drive your kids to school. The free-range child is a heck of a lot better than the battery-hen child in life. Who would have thought?
Tim Gill on a previous episode said children raised in captivity I thought that was really interesting, and I forgot the word he used. I thought, oh yeah, they're incarcerated. That is actually how they are. Children today are raised in incarceration.
There's an issue here for Werribee. Caboolture West, giant new estate about to be built. No priority public transport corridor going to be built into that estate until it's basically built out, when everyone has a car for everyone between the age of 18 and 80. We are at risk of Education Queensland doing what it has been doing to these new release communities for some time. They're going to build one big super school for 2,000 primary school students, and the catchment size will be 3 kilometres or more for kids to get there, which is beyond the distance a 10-year-old is going to ride a bike, and way beyond the distance any child other than who live really, really locally is going to be able to walk to school. Because an education department is, to be frank, just trying to save some pennies. They are going to condemn parents in that estate to have to organise their lives around driving children to school. And that tends to fall on women.
Before, you said that kids, when they walk and they ride to school, they're ready to actually turn up and learn. By not having a school which people can walk to, ride to, it means that kids are more restless and not ready because they haven't exercised, which means that teachers have a much harder time, which means the retention in teachers is low, because who wants to be in front of 30 kids who are going feral?
Or who wants to manage the 1 kilometre queue of cars that is coming to the school gates? I've photographed them. I've been to them. I've walked down and talked to parents stuck in them. We've done research with these children. We gave them cameras and said, photograph what you can see on your way home. And the children who were in the cars photographed the back of mum's head, photographed themselves playing video games. When we went and asked them lots of questions, those kids had less friends. They had less actual physical connections to other humans. The children who were free range were out in the playgrounds, in the nature spaces of this very nice estate built by one of the large land release developers. Very good space. But the education department shortchanged everyone by building a super school and not small schools. Study after study around the world show that children in small and modest-sized schools tend to do better educationally than children in large schools.
We'll wrap it up there, but it does go to show what cars do and the sort of supersizing of everything, that on one level it looks like you're saving money for the short term, particularly in education, but then you actually have these huge on costs later.
Or immediately, and those transport costs are being put onto the parents and the guardians and the grandmas and everyone else.
Exactly. And then you're reducing productivity and community, and then you're increasing social isolation because not everybody can drive, which is a huge economic burden. Anyway, we could go on forever, Matt, but we've come to the end of time. Normally I say any final thoughts, but I'm too worried if I do that, we'll just keep talking and talking and talking. Super great to chat with you as always. I've been wanting to get you on the show for ages. I think it was about a year ago when I first started the podcast. So we'll definitely have you back another time.
Yeah, there's a lot to discuss.
And on that note, we will conclude before anything else is said. As I said, it's been great to chat. So thank you very much for taking the time. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for listening to the Streets and People podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. Your small action could make a big difference. We're on all the usual podcasting platforms, so don't miss a single story. To find out what else we do, check out getaroundcaboolture.au. Until next time, remember, there's more than one way to get where you're going. Keep moving, keep listening, and keep imagining streets made for people.